This PowerPoint is on Mrs. Burling. Now, when we talked about her husband, Mr. Burling, we said that he was that archetypal capitalist. He was meant to represent capitalism. Now, for Mrs. Burling, she's also an archetype. Hold on, to get a wee bit of colour going on here. Okay, so she's also an archetype. But for her, it's not about capitalism. It's about class. Primarily upper class. Remember, she is socially superior to her husband, and she's meant to represent the upper class. Those people who are so far up the social hierarchy that they cannot ever contemplate having any sort of empathy or connection with those below them. The first time you see her, again, is in that opening tableau. And remember, that's a really important part, because what it does, it gives you that exposition of character. We understand who these people are in terms of individuals, in terms of characters, through the expositional stage directions in that tableau. So, what is she described as? Well, she's described as her husband's social superior, so immediately class is connected with Mrs. Birling right from the very start. And also she's associated as being a rather cold woman. Now there you have to think of the word cold. The word cold there is about emotional coldness, about distance and detachment. And remember, for somebody like Priestley, who's very much a socialist, who's very much trying to bring around a level of equality, distance and detachment and coldness and those sort of negative things would all be associated in his eyes, in his political understanding, with the upper strata of society, with the upper and upper middle classes. So this characterization of Mrs. Birling as intricately linked with class and emotionally cold, like sterile, emotionally sterile, those are things that she cannot escape. We see them throughout. First time that she speaks, she is reproachfully speaking to her husband. She criticises him for his mistake in congratulating the cook. Now, for her, it's a mistake because the cook has a job to do, and therefore she should do it and not be congratulated for it. And again, it's about that sense of detachment, that she has this detachment from other people. You know, that's the cook's job, not there's a cook who's an individual, but she's a cook. I'm detached from her because she is my servant. And what you also have too is this acting as another way of exposing Mrs. Birling's character, because what she does is that she can very clearly see she's alert to the faults in others, but she's not alert. She's completely and utterly lacking in self-awareness. This is a very important meal. Mr. Burling is trying to ingratiate himself with Gerald Croft, and what does she do? She immediately brings tension in. She immediately brings tension into this scene. So again, it shows perhaps a self-centeredness of Mrs. Burling, but also her lack of self-awareness. The subtext here, what is beneath the words, is that there is a social gap between husband and wife, and that perhaps that is linked to some sense of unspoken dissatisfaction. But let's be clear, why would Mrs. Birling have married Burling? Obviously she could have done better for herself, but she married him. There could be many reasons. For example, Burling had money and her family perhaps could be impoverishedly noble, but the point is you don't know any of that. There also is the understanding that she could have loved him, that they could be united by affection, and they certainly do operate as a unit. Relationship with Sheila, mother-daughter relationship, it's a bit contentious as well. Really, contention seems to underline most of the relationships that Mrs. Birling has. So, first of all, what she does is she speaks on behalf of her daughter. She does this twice. Now, her daughter is just about to be married. She is no longer a child. She has a voice and a mind of her own, and yet Mrs. Birling sees it as her responsibility to speak for her daughter. What she wants to do is she wants to pacify the tension that there's obviously there between Sheila and Gerald, which is ironic considering that she's the first person who really brings tension into the room with the reproachful comment to her husband. Now, Sheila is subtly criticising Gerald that he didn't come near her any time last summer, but for Mrs. Burling, she doesn't pick up on that criticism. That's not what she wants. What she wants is to pacify things, and what also she wants to do is she finds fault in her daughter, and she makes that clear. She says to her that she has to get used to coming secondary in her husband's life. Business will come first, that she has to get used to it, therefore implying that that's what Mrs. Birling has got used to. But what you have here is a link to the theme of gender and the theme of age, because Sheila says that she won't get used to that. She's not going to be like her mother. Mrs. Burling thinks that generations just merely repeat the actions of those who came before, so it's just a cycle of repeated activity. But that's not what Sheila wants. Sheila says to her mother, no, that she won't get used to it. Sheila is not going to be unprogressive. Sheila is not going to be traditional, and that's quite hard for Mrs. Burling to accept, but Sheila says it. So you have to remember that gives us an understanding that there is capacity within Sheila to change, and we see that throughout the play as she changes in terms of her moral outlook on life. Also too, whenever Arthur Burling goes on about the unification of the Crofts and Burlings, it's Sybil who tries to bring everything back again to the speech, to the idea that this is Sheila's special night. And what we have again is this idea that for Mrs. Burling, she is in some ways defined by her role as a mother. She's continuing it even though her children are no longer children. You know, she has grown up children, and yet she is continuing to mother them in the way that she would have done when they were smaller. Perhaps it suggests that she enjoys the power, but also it gives us this idea that money can infantilize people. It can make them stay immature. It can cosset them. It can keep them away from the harshness of life, so they can be pampered and babied to the extent where they act in an immature fashion. Okay, now you also have this idea that at that time, in Edwardian times, whenever men and women would dine together, there would be a point where the men would stay around the table and enjoy cigars and port, and the women would go to the drawing room. They would withdraw the drawing room, where they would go and talk about female things. And of course, Mrs. Burling does the right thing. She takes Sheila to the drawing room, as is the fashion at the time. But I suppose it's quite ironic that she's the one who decides when that will happen. You know, she's the one who leaves the men to their business, and perhaps that gives us this idea that she never quite accepted that if she did get used to her husband being always busy with work, she didn't allow that to perhaps manifest itself in her being inferior to her husband. She is still in control. Okay, Mrs. Burling in Act 2 then. Act 2 begins with, of course, Gerald and Sheila and the inspector, and it's Mrs. Burling who enters into that when things have been made known, when we find out that Gerald is implicated in the death of Eva Smith. Now, Mrs. Burling's entrance in Act 2 is a dramatic one because she moves with, it says, sage directions, self-confidence. She moves self-confidently into a room. But the key thing is, when she walks into that room, she's walking into a room that has had all the self-assurance and respectively drained out of it, because what we have found out is that Gerald is a philanderer. He has had a sexual affair. He has cheated on his fiancée. So this is a room full of tension. This is a room full of recrimination. This is a room full of doubt. And yet she walks into that room as if it were perfectly tranquil within that room, which it is not. Now, it tells you something very important. What it does is it tells you again about this lack of awareness that Mrs. Burling has. Her appearance clashes with the mood in the room. She's arrogant, she lacks awareness, and it gives you this idea that she just cannot pick up on the emotions of other people. That there is this detachment that is so profound that she doesn't even realize. She doesn't even realize when she is walking into a room that's filled with such tension. She can't feel it. Perhaps that she's stuck in this little bubble of her own self-satisfaction, and she cannot understand, she cannot empathize with others. The other thing is that she's anachronist, and an anachronism. Now, anachronism is something that's out of its own time. And Mrs. Burling seems very much like that, because she speaks with the same easy tone that she spoke with in Act 1. That she's this old-fashioned traditional woman who doesn't perhaps belong in a world that will change and in a world that will modernise. Her tone contrasts sharply with that Sheila uses. She says, "Mother, please," and it shows that Sheila's in this highly nervous state, but her mother is indifferent to it. Her mother continues with her superior attitude, even when that superior attitude just doesn't fit anymore. It seems old-fashioned, it seemed out of place. And again, this idea that Mrs. Burling has no sense of empathy, cannot understand the feelings of others, even that of her own daughter. Okay, Mrs. Burling, she is described as affecting great surprise. Now, affecting there means to pretend or act in a particular way that she doesn't feel. And I think it's an important word used in relation to Mrs. Burling, because Mrs. Burling is perhaps an affectation. She acts, she pretends. She believes herself to be highly civilized. She believes herself to be respectable, but that's actually a role that she's playing, because she is not civilized. She is not respectable. A respectable woman does not throw a pregnant woman out onto the streets when she has nowhere else to go. A civilized person does not criticize a pregnant girl for actions that do not seem to be her fault. And yet this is the pretense, this is the act that Mrs. Burling indulges in. She has the costume of a civilized and respectful woman, but she isn't. She comes across as she sort of, it's as if her costume in some ways is removed throughout this play, but she doesn't see it, because she comes across as a bigoted individual. And class is, she's emblematic of class. Class is about difference. It's about defining. It's about labelling. It's about creating that idea of, well, us against them, and that's something that she very much does. The other thing is that, just as we said with Mr. Burling that he has this myopia, he has this short-sightedness, so you have this lack of sight in Mrs. Burling, because she doesn't see the value in what is happening. She doesn't see the value in her own children and how their eyes are being opened to the world in a different way by the inspector. She dismisses the case of Eva Smith as absurd business. She cannot see that it would have any value to her or to her world to see things in a different way. She, like Gerald, seems to have very poor opinion of her daughter's temperament. She says that Eva Smith's story is only of interest to Sheila because of morbid curiosity. Again, this idea that she doesn't know her child, she's quite damning in relation to her child. As I said in the previous slide, there is this idea of myopia, short-sightedness, lack of sight that Mrs. Burling and her husband share. And the key thing is, it's Sheila who's trying to subtly guide her mother through this moral minefield, but Mrs. Burling just doesn't understand it, and of course her ego would not allow her to play second fiddle to her daughter, so obviously anything that Sheila's trying to do is going to be dismissed because Mrs. Burling's ego wouldn't have it. Mrs. Burling links Eva to class, just as Mrs. Burling herself, very much so at the start, was linked to class with her husband's socialist superior. The first thing that Mrs. Burling does for Eva is link her to class, because Mrs. Burling thinks that class defines every part of an individual. And she says girls of that class, as if Eva couldn't be an individual. Humans aren't individuals, they're just different parts of this social makeup. They're just different classes. And Sheila can understand how her mother is wrong in this, and she reacts by that stage direction urgently trying to get her mother from exposing her prejudice, making it obvious to the inspector and to the audience that she is a bigoted individual. There's a nice irony in the fact that Sheila knows her mother's feelings, that Sheila is aware of her mother and her mother's capabilities, and that's different when we consider how little Mrs. Burling knows Sheila. But what Sheila does is she uses probably the most important metaphor in the play. She says that her mother is allowing class to build a wall that the inspector will just break down. And that metaphor of building a wall is so important because that's something new. That's something new for Sheila. She's worked that out. Between the end of Act 1 and this part of Act 2, she's actually made that huge understanding, that huge leap, and she can see her mother for what she is. And again, ironically, her mother can never see Sheila for what she is. Even at the end, she can't see her. But that metaphor of the wall is linked to class for two reasons. Because, first of all, for Mrs. Burling, class is a means of protection, a barrier which prevents them from having to acknowledge those who are socially beneath them. So it separates them. It separates them from the working class, who they see as flawed. But for Sheila then, Sheila understands something different. She understands that perhaps class is a prison. What it does is, just that point about class being a prison. Because what it does is it traps those, I wonder why it's doing that. It traps those who are behind it into their old immoral, selfish ways. And that's something that Mrs. Burling never picks up on. For Mrs. Burling, the morality of her decision is justified by her sanctimonious, her arrogant belief that she's doing the right thing. She really cannot see at all how anything that she's done is wrong, because what she does is she ranks people according to how she believes them to be deserving or undeserving of their fate. Sheila can see this in her mother. She can see how her mother is so deeply prejudiced, and unfortunately we as an audience member, we can see that too. Mrs. Burling never does. She sees anything to do with morality linked to working classes as just being impertinent, i.e. having ideas above their station. Mrs. Burling's idiolect, that word that we've just used, impertinent, she uses that several times. And what she does is she uses language to reinforce class boundaries. Impertinence is all about acting beyond and outside your class, and her language is about reinforcing her power, reinforcing her control. She speaks haughtily. She says things like, "I beg your pardon," all of which give us this idea that she sees herself as being socially superior. You've got that word impertinent I said there. It's a word that really belongs to an adult when speaking to errant children, not a policeman when undergoing a very serious police investigation. She says that using the Burling's name, Eva's use of the Burling's name, was gross impertinence. Again, she's always talking down. She's always reinforcing that people should act within their own class. And Sheila says that the word impertinence is a silly word, and it is, because it's a word that belongs to a different time. It's a word that belongs to an old-fashioned view of life. And Sheila understands that it has no time or place in what the inspector is trying to do, which is try to bring progressive understanding into this household. Mrs. Burling is really antagonistic towards the inspector. She's deliberately dismissive of him. Whenever she speaks to him, she speaks in a curt and abrasive manner. And because of that, he speaks to her very severely. He speaks to her sharply. Mrs. Burling, when she's speaking to the inspector, she uses these monosyllabic phrases. All she does is give him the minimum amount of information. And what she is recalcitrant. She is completely and utterly without remorse. She is completely and utterly justified in what she does, or so she thinks. And again, she links what she did to her duty. She sees herself as that civilized, responsible woman that we talked about earlier before. Now, the play began with some tension between Mr. and Mrs. Burling, and here you have some more tension at the end of Act 2 when they exchange bewildered and rather frightened glances, because I think then they realise what Eric has been up to. Also too, you have the idea that Burling shows where his loyalties truly lie when he says to Mrs. Burling that what has happened, the press might take an interest in this scandal. And instead of Mrs. Burling contemplating that, focusing on her position, what she does is she just puts that straight back onto her husband. She reminds Burling of his role. She doesn't mind if her husband is put through it. Their relationship is one that will never ever take precedence over their own individual self-interest. We've said this all the way through, but there is such a lack of self-awareness in Mrs. Burling that she doesn't understand how bigoted she really is. And it comes across most strongly in this idea that when she's talking about Eva and the use of the Burling name, she said that was one of the reasons that prejudiced me against her case. So she admits to being being prejudiced, and she uses the word naturally as if we would all be equally prejudiced, as if she thinks the whole world views everything the way that she does. She has no capacity to understand that people have different ways of living their life. They have different viewpoints on life, and her coldness is made apparent when she says that she's sorry for Eva, but suggests that she only has herself to blame. So she cannot even be sympathetic to Eva wholeheartedly. She always has to apportion blame and responsibility on Eva. And again, there's an irony there that Mrs. Burling is one to apportion out responsibility, and yet she never accepts any of her own. She is a private and a public individual. She had a duty of care to look after the vulnerable and the desperate, and she didn't do it. She put her public duty second on the list. Private responsibility to uphold the Burling name was first. With the relationship between Mrs. Burling and Eva, the basic thing that you get is Mrs. Burling's arrogance. She denies basic human integrity to the working classes, because I think this is important for Mrs. Burling. She equates financial poverty with moral poverty. You know, how could a poor girl have elaborate fine feelings? How could a poor girl refuse money knowing that she was stolen? She thinks that if you're poor, then morally you're going to be equally, equally lacking in judgment. The key thing is also the idea about class that she stereotypes. She said girls of that class, a girl of that sort. She's incapable of seeing anybody as an individual, and she cannot act in a way other than one that reinforces her superiority, whether that be social or moral. She puts herself on this undeserved moral plane. She believes that everything that she does is completely and utterly justifiable. And she cannot see the flaw within her, and therefore we have this idea that she falls into the trap. The inspector, just as she thinks she's being so clever, she really falls into the inspector's trap, and by creating this wall between herself and others, we can enjoy her being in that trap. She deserves it. Okay. Little bit of dramatic irony for Mrs. Burling, and again we've had dramatic irony before. Mr. Burling's monologues were filled with dramatic irony, and they exposed how stupid he was, and here Mrs. Burling, the dramatic irony again, exposes how stupid she's been. She's walked right into the inspector's trap with her determination that the culprit should be compelled to confess in public. That's what the inspector wanted her to say. She does exactly as he wanted her to. And we as an audience know that we're talking about Eric here. Even as Sheila so alarmed, she knows that. But Mrs. Burling, her supercilious, her arrogant attitude allows her to be completely and utterly without awareness. She doesn't know how stupid she has been and how willingly and easily she has been trapped. Okay, when Mrs. Burling does find out about Eric and what he's been up to, for the first time Mrs. Burling is described as being distressed. Now, again, Mrs. Burling is a flat character. She's incapable of moral change. We know that. However, if it came to counter-argument, we would have to find something to say about Mrs. Burling that would be in some way positive. And I suppose you could say that this use of the stage direction distressed would be it, because she obviously is distressed that her son is in a terrible situation. There's obviously some sense of maternal feeling, and also too, as a mother, she has been responsible for perhaps keeping her children in their childlike state. So it's ironic that as a mother she has been overly protective, and yet she doesn't understand these kids, that there isn't that emotional bond there. But you cannot deny that she's distressed for Eric here, so a sympathetic audience could see some maternal feeling creeping in. And she says in her dialogue, she's got lots of hyphens here, and she goes, she couldn't believe that of him. She believed he was better than that. She never thought he would be like that. So all mothers think that their kids are great, and she obviously believed that Eric was a good boy, that she'd raised him in a particular way. So if we're going to talk about her, we cannot deny that she's emotionally cold. She is. But this one point perhaps allows maternal feeling to come in. Now, once that maternal feeling does come in, it's immediately contrasted with a lack of emotional connection suggested by Eric. He says, "You haven't made it any easier for me." And what he does throughout Act 3 is this criticism of his mother and her parenting. There isn't that emotional attachment. It hasn't been easy for Eric to be around his parents, to feel connected to his parents. That might be some of the reasoning behind Eric and his reliance on alcohol, but let's never make too much about that. But what we have here is a nice little bit of irony, because wealth and status have provided their children with everything that they could want financially, but they haven't provided them with that emotional richness that they needed. And also the wealth and financial status that the Burlings have provided their kids with has allowed their kids to exploit those beneath them very easily and without much regret. Again, if we want to be sympathetic to Mrs. Burling, if we want to see her in a different light for counter-argument's sake, we would have to point out that in Act 3, that even though she's been so imperious, that she's been this sort of ice queen throughout, in Act 3, her husband does try to take charge, speaks to her in a gentler manner, because he doesn't want her to be exposed to whatever confession Eric has to make. Therefore, she does have sensitive feelings at times, and her husband wants to protect her from anything that's harsh. But she doesn't go, and Mrs. Burling does hear all of Eric's story. And what shocks her most, really, isn't that Eric had the encounter. She is shocked most when she discovers that her son is a thief. In her eyes, a man can force himself on a woman of a lesser class, but not steal from his betters. So again, even when she's shocked about her son and his actions, it's always linked to social superiority in some way. Okay, does Mrs. Burling learn? No, she doesn't learn. She learns nothing. She's recalcitrant, a word that we used before. She hides behind that wall, and nothing seems to be able to get through it. It's an impenetrable wall, but also remember that it's a prison for her. She's an old-fashioned, traditional person, and what Priestley is trying to show is that there isn't room for that, and there isn't room for that outlook in life any longer in the 20th century, that progress has to happen. Well, that's what the inspector's there to stimulate. He's the catalyst behind all that. So whenever Eric criticizes her so harshly with the damn you, she shakes her head, but she does not reply. She doesn't accept responsibility for Eric's hurt and Eric's sense of betrayal there. And when the inspector leaves, all that she does is she reforms her alliance with her husband. And they begin to criticize their children again. She tells Eric that she's absolutely ashamed of him. She comes to life again, and I think that's a great metaphor, because it shows you that that she is back to the person that she was in Act 1. That if she veered off that path for a little while, it was merely misdirection. She's back to the person, that sort of impervious, cold, calculating woman that she was in Act 1. What she wants to do is she accuses her children of wanting to help the inspector, as if that they have taken sides, which of course they have. But what it does is it shows that there's a shallowness within Mrs. Burling, because when she doubts the inspector, her doubts are because he never talked like a police inspector, he never looked like one. And I think that's important, because what it does is it shows that Mrs. Burling's understanding never goes beyond the superficial. She doesn't see beyond it, and therefore it brings us back to that word that we have, affecting great surprise. That she's always acting a role. It's all about pretense. It's all about the exterior. It's all about appearance. It's all about the superficial things in life, and those are the things that she values. And she valued them in Act 1, and she values them in Act 3. And she is recalcitrant, and she does not break. She gets fooled and she gets trapped, but it doesn't put her off her stride. She returns to her previous state. Nice wee word for that is atavistic. Atavistic means when you return to your previous state. And that's what she does. But the argument is that she never really veered off it very far. Okay, that's her.